Amy Dunne didn't just fall in love, she weaponized it. She turned what was once a symbol of connection into a tool for control. But why? What happens when perfection doesn't just fail us, but breaks us beyond repair? Amy Dunne was, by all accounts, the perfect woman. She was charming, intelligent, and beautiful, the epitome of the ideal partner. But behind the mask of perfection lay a soul that was slowly being crushed under the weight of unreal expectations. From a young age, Amy learned that love could be a game, a performance, a perfect act to be admired. She became obsessed with the idea of perfection, not just in herself, but in her relationship with Nick. Every move, every word, every gesture was calculated to fit into this flawless image. But perfection is an illusion, and Amy's pursuit of it started to tear her apart. She wasn't just trying to be perfect for Nick, she was trying to be perfect for the world. And when that world didn't appreciate her efforts, when Nick's attention shifted elsewhere, something inside her broke. It wasn't just a simple heartbreak. It was a full collapse of everything she had built around herself. Amy's defense mechanism wasn't just to retreat or wallow in self-pity, she fought back. But this fight wasn't external. No, she turned her rage inward, weaponizing her emotions. Love, something she once cherished, became her most dangerous weapon. Amy began to use it as a way to control, manipulate, and even punish those who had failed to see her perfection, especially Nick. She was no longer the woman he married, she had become a puppet master, pulling the strings of love with cold precision. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. Love had failed her, but she could still use it to ensure that no one could ever take advantage of her again. Amy's inner conflict was clear, she was torn between her desire for validation and her need to protect herself from further harm. She craved love, but she couldn't trust it anymore. Her perfection had shattered, and now she sought to shatter everyone around her in return. The trigger was simple, Nick's betrayal. It was the moment when Amy realized that love, as she understood it, wasn't going to save her. It was never about love. It was about control. And the breakdown was inevitable. Amy didn't just lose herself, she remade herself into someone unrecognizable, someone who would stop at nothing to reclaim her power. The consequence was severe. Amy's love became toxic, turning her into a figure of fear and manipulation. But what was the cost? Was it worth it? Amy's emotional bridge to the audience is in the realization that, deep down, we all fear the same thing, to love without being loved in return. To give everything and receive nothing. And so, the question lingers, can love still be love if it's been twisted beyond recognition? Amy's world had always been one of carefully constructed illusions. She was the picture of perfection, the type of woman everyone envied. But beneath this flawless surface was a woman constantly battling with her own insecurities. Amy had been raised with the expectation that she should be something extraordinary, not just for herself, but for the world around her. From the very beginning, she had been taught that to be loved, she must be perfect. She wasn't allowed to have flaws, to show weakness, or to appear vulnerable. These ideas were drilled into her from childhood, and over time, they shaped her entire identity. The cracks in her persona started to show when she married Nick. Initially, their relationship seemed perfect, two people who complemented each other, their lives intertwined in a way that seemed destined to be. But as their marriage progressed, the pressure Amy had placed on herself to be flawless began to take a toll. She started to feel the weight of her own image. Nick, who once adored her, began to show signs of dissatisfaction, and that was when Amy's deepest fear started to materialize. The love she had carefully cultivated in her mind began to slip away. It was not just the betrayal she felt when Nick's attention wandered. It was the fact that he could no longer see the perfect woman she had worked so hard to become. That loss of admiration, that disconnection, was more painful than any outward betrayal. It shattered her sense of self-worth. Amy's trauma wasn't just emotional, it was existential. The perfection she had chased her entire life, the idea that she could be everything to everyone, was unraveling. She was no longer the flawless woman Nick had married, she was becoming a version of herself she couldn't even recognize. This inner conflict left her in a constant state of turmoil. She needed to be loved, yet she couldn't allow herself to be vulnerable enough to receive it. Her love had always been conditional, built on the need for admiration rather than authentic connection. And as she grew more desperate, she became increasingly obsessed with the idea of reclaiming control. Her defense mechanism, the one she had developed to protect herself from the fear of being abandoned, was to keep everyone at a distance emotionally. She couldn't let anyone see the cracks in her facade because if they did, it would confirm her worst fear, that she wasn't enough. This led Amy to push Nick away while still desperately needing his validation. The trigger that finally set everything into motion was Nick's affair. It wasn't just about the infidelity, it was about the final nail in the coffin of her carefully curated identity. She realized that if she couldn't be perfect in his eyes, she had no value. Her response wasn't one of justifiable anger. It was an unraveling of everything she had ever believed about herself. And in that breakdown, Amy decided that if she couldn't have love on her terms, she would create it. She would manipulate it, twist it, and shape it into something that could control her fate. Amy's transformation from a woman seeking validation to someone willing to manipulate love itself reflected the ultimate consequence of her obsession with perfection. She was no longer the person who sought love, she became someone who used it to get what she wanted, to assert her power in a world that had failed her. In the end, Amy's journey wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her sense of self, even if it meant destroying everything in her path. And so, she stood at the center of her own emotional battlefield, torn between the desire for connection and the need for control. In that moment, we are left with a question: is it possible to truly love without the fear of losing yourself in the process? Amy's life had always been built on a delicate balance of control and perfection. She wasn't just a woman in a marriage, she was an image, a carefully curated version of herself that others admired. But the cracks began to appear when the very thing she had relied on, her sense of perfection, started to crumble. The more she pushed to maintain the ideal of the perfect wife, the more she began to lose touch with who she really was. The demands of her marriage to Nick, along with society's expectations of who she should be, created a deep internal conflict. On the one hand, Amy longed for the love and admiration she had grown accustomed to, but on the other hand, she couldn't allow herself to be vulnerable enough to truly receive it. She had learned early on that in order to be loved, she had to be perfect, and this perfection came at the cost of her own authenticity. As time went on, Amy's internal turmoil intensified. She didn't just want love, she needed it to confirm her worth. Yet, no matter how much she gave of herself, no matter how much she sacrificed for Nick, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was never truly seen. She had become a reflection of what others wanted her to be, rather than a woman who was loved for her true self. This struggle between the need for validation and the fear of being exposed was the root of her emotional distress. The love she received was always conditional, based on how well she conformed to a set of ideals she didn't even fully believe in. And when Nick's attention shifted elsewhere, when he no longer saw her as the perfect woman, Amy's worst fear was realized. She was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with. In that moment, the internal conflict reached its breaking point. Amy's need to be perfect had left her with nothing but emptiness. She had worked so hard to maintain an image that she had forgotten what it meant to simply be herself. The love she had longed for had always been about approval, about fulfilling the expectations of others. The real emotional need that had been ignored for so long was to be loved for who she was, without having to earn it through perfection. But as the cracks in her image grew wider, Amy could no longer hide the truth from herself. She had spent so much of her life suppressing her own needs and desires in favor of creating an idealized version of herself. She had neglected the parts of her that were messy, flawed, and real. And when Nick's betrayal finally broke through the facade she had so carefully built, Amy found herself at a crossroads. Her fear of vulnerability, her fear of being unworthy, had turned into an obsession with control. She couldn't let herself fall apart, she couldn't let anyone see her weakness. So she made a decision: if she couldn't be loved for who she truly was, she would create a version of love that worked for her. This version of love wouldn't be about connection or mutual respect, it would be a tool, a way to manipulate and control her world in a way that would protect her from further hurt. Amy's emotional need, her desperate, unfulfilled need, was for love that didn't demand perfection. But in her pursuit of this love, she transformed it into something twisted, something that would never allow her to be truly free. In trying to meet the demands of the world, Amy lost sight of the one thing she needed most, to simply be seen, without the pressure to be perfect. Amy had always believed in the illusion of control. Her world was one of meticulous planning, where every aspect of her life was designed to fit the image she believed was necessary for her survival. The perfect wife, the perfect woman, these roles were her shield, her armor against a world that had shown her time and again that love and acceptance were not guaranteed. But the trigger that would shatter this fragile facade came unexpectedly, not as a dramatic confrontation, but through something much more subtle at Nick's affair. It was not just an act of betrayal, it was the final confirmation of her deepest fear. For years, Amy had worked relentlessly to uphold the idealized version of herself that Nick had fallen in love with. She had sacrificed parts of her identity, her authenticity, in order to maintain this image of perfection. And yet, despite all of her efforts, Nick's attention drifted. The trigger was not the affair itself, but the realization that all the work, all the sacrifices she had made, had amounted to nothing. She was no longer the woman he desired, no longer the perfect partner. In that moment, Amy's world began to unravel. Her identity, so tightly woven around the concept of perfection, was exposed for what it truly was, a mask. She had spent so much time creating this flawless persona that she had forgotten who she really was beneath it. The weight of this realization was crushing. For Amy, perfection had been the only thing she could control. It was the one thing that had kept her safe from rejection, from the vulnerability of being truly seen. But now, with Nick's affair, she saw that her control had always been an illusion. Her need for perfection had isolated her, pushing her further away from the real connection she had longed for. The affair was not just about betrayal, it was about the collapse of everything Amy had come to rely on. It was a mirror reflecting the truth she had avoided for so long, that love cannot be earned through perfection, that no amount of carefully constructed facades can keep a relationship intact when there is no true emotional connection. The psychological turning point for Amy was when she understood that her approach to love, based on control, on perfection, had not worked. This realization ignited a shift in her. She could no longer pretend that her perfect image had saved her. She could no longer rely on the facade she had built around herself. Instead, she decided to take control in a new way. If love, as she had known it, had failed her, she would make it work on her terms. She would shape it, manipulate it, and wield it as a weapon. The truth of her broken identity, exposed by Nick's betrayal, became the catalyst for her transformation. She was no longer a woman seeking validation through perfection. She was a woman determined to take back control, even if it meant twisting the very thing she had once cherished. This was the beginning of Amy's psychological breakdown, the moment when the mask she had worn for so long was finally torn away, leaving behind a woman who would stop at nothing to rebuild herself on her own terms. Amy's transformation was not a sudden eruption of rage or despair, it was a slow, creeping shift in her psyche that took root in the aftermath of betrayal. With Nick's affair, she had reached the point of no return. The perfection she had so carefully constructed around herself no longer held any meaning. The image of the perfect wife, the perfect woman, was shattered beyond repair. For years, Amy had relied on the belief that if she could maintain this flawless exterior, she could control the narrative of her life. She believed that perfection would keep her safe, that it would shield her from rejection, from vulnerability, from the fear of being unloved. But now, faced with the truth of Nick's infidelity, the mask she had so carefully built began to crumble. This was the breaking point. It wasn't just about losing her husband's love, it was about losing her entire sense of self. The woman she had been, the woman who had given so much of herself to create this perfect marriage, was now exposed for what she really was, someone who had never allowed herself to truly be loved. Amy's breakdown was not simply emotional. It was existential. The realization that all of her efforts had been in vain, that her perfect persona was nothing more than a facade, hit her with the force of a crashing wave. She was no longer the person she had worked so hard to be. The perfection she had fought for had left her hollow, with nothing but a shattered identity. But this breakdown also marked the beginning of Amy's transformation. Faced with the collapse of everything she had believed in, she had to find a new way to survive. She couldn't go back to the woman she had been, too much had been broken. Instead, she chose to rebuild herself, not by seeking validation through perfection, but by taking control in a different way. She decided that love, which had failed her in the past, could be used as a tool for her own gain. She no longer sought love for the sake of connection or affection. She no longer cared about being loved for who she truly was. Instead, she would use love as a weapon. She would manipulate it, twist it, and use it to get what she wanted. This was not about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about power, power over herself, power over her circumstances, and power over the people who had failed her. As Amy's psychological breakdown continued, she shed the last remnants of her old self. She was no longer the woman who had longed for approval, she was a woman who would stop at nothing to ensure her survival. The perfection she had once strived for was now replaced with a new kind of control, one that allowed her to bend the world to her will. In her mind, the world had failed her, and now it was time for her to take back everything she had lost. Amy's journey had gone from one of self-doubt and desperation to one of cold calculation. She had been broken, but in that brokenness, she found the strength to rebuild herself in a way that no one, not even Nick, could ever predict. Amy's transformation into a woman who used love as a weapon came with consequences, and these consequences extended far beyond her immediate actions. While she may have believed she regained control of her life, the psychological toll of her choices would haunt her for years to come. The first and most obvious consequence was the way she had to continue wearing a mask. After the breakdown of her marriage, Amy could no longer maintain the image of the perfect wife, but she had also shed the woman she once was. She was trapped in a new identity, one that she had created out of necessity but could never fully embrace. The perfection she had so desperately clung to had been replaced by a new facade, the cold, calculating woman who used others for her own benefit. This transformation wasn't just external, it was deep within her psyche. She had learned to manipulate love to suit her needs, but in doing so, she had lost the ability to form genuine, meaningful connections. The emotional scars of her earlier experiences, the fear of being unloved, the betrayal she had suffered, all remained. They festered beneath the surface, and every action she took to control her environment only reinforced the walls she had built around herself. These walls weren't just protective, they were isolating. Amy had once longed for love, for a connection with another person. But now, love had become something she wielded like a weapon, a tool she used to manipulate those around her. The very thing she had sought for so long, authentic affection, was now something she could no longer trust or even comprehend. The emotional toll of this transformation was evident. Amy's sense of self-worth became increasingly tied to her ability to control the narrative of her life, to make others conform to the roles she had assigned them. This need for control, which had started as a way to protect herself from rejection, became an obsession that consumed her. In the end, Amy had replaced the hope of genuine connection with a cold, strategic approach to life. While she may have regained a sense of power in the short term, she had lost something much more valuable, the ability to be vulnerable, to be loved for who she truly was. Over time, this would become a deeply painful realization. The consequences of her actions, the walls she had built, would leave her isolated and alone. She could manipulate others, but she could never truly connect with them. The loneliness that had once driven her to seek perfection would now follow her everywhere. Amy's psychological breakdown had opened a new chapter in her life, but it wasn't one that led to peace or fulfillment. It led to a hollow existence, one where she was constantly battling her own fears and insecurities. The emotional scars of her past would forever haunt her, as the woman who had once craved love now found herself unable to receive it, even if she wanted to. The long-term psychological effects of her transformation were clear. Amy had traded her ability to love for the ability to control, but in doing so, she had lost the very thing that had once given her life meaning.